Hey everyone, we are now doing a reading that's going to help us think about a bunch of big themes. So I um, I know this reading by Kant is a little strange. Part of why I teach it actually is because it's strange. So it's supposed to make you think and force you to sort of reason out what he might be saying for yourself. But of course, my job as your teacher is also to help make it comprehensible. So what we're going to use Kant to talk about are a bunch of big themes. We're going to talk about history specifically. We're going to ask the question of whether the human race progresses morally, whether we make progress towards a better state of affairs for humanity. We're going to talk about globalism. We're going to talk about that even though Kant wrote this about 200 years ago, a little more than 200 years ago, we're going to ask the question, something that he already saw coming, which is that the world is more and more unified today. There's more and more connections globally around the world. Now, that's just sort of a fact. So how do we turn that fact into a moral or ethical question? Well, one of the ways is this. If we're in a more and more global and more unified world now, and if that seems to just be the general tendency, more and more connection, then what should we do about refugees and immigration? I'll just leave that as a question now. And so the main question we're going to ask about is progress, whether the world makes moral and political progress. Kant says yes in a very interesting and complicated way. He says yes. And for us, that'll raise the question of, well, specifically, if with things like the UN and international treaties and international commerce, if the world's more and more a single community, how do we respond to that? So the first part may seem, it's a little disconnected from the rest, but it is important. It's connected within the larger piece that I took this section from. But he says, there's certain sort of basic human rights that regulate immigration. And he says that you have the right, always, the right of what he calls hospitality. He says hospitality basically dictates two related things. So two related things on the part of the person visiting and the person being visited, basically. So just like with hospitality, I don't have to welcome you into my house, right? As, say, a homeowner or a country, I can say, sorry, you can't come here. And I don't really have to give a reason. My house / my country, my rules. Okay? But Kant says, you can, of course, let people into your house or country. He's just saying you don't have an obligation as a country or person to let someone in. But of course you can. Obligation doesn't mean you must not. It just means you do not have to. So he says, if you choose to let someone in, then you do have an obligation. Once you let them in, you now have the obligation to treat them with hospitality. Treat them as a guest, he says, which basically means respect them as a human being and respect basically their human rights. Okay, that's Kant's stance, is that unless the person's life is threatened, so if their life's actually threatened, just like in your house, if someone's about to get shot outside your house, if you can let them in and save their life without risking anything, yeah, you really have to do that. But that's a rare situation. In general, it's just that someone wants to come in, you don't have to let them. If you choose to, though, it's a free choice. If you choose to, then you have to sort of treat them with a minimum standard of decency. Now, Kant says there's a reason for this. He's not just saying, well, this is his preference or he thinks that's the way things should be. He says, we are all bound to that basic rule because of a fact about human nature. And the same fact will be important for the progress question we'll ask in a moment. He says since we all live on the same earth, you're automatically related to other people. You already have some kind of connection with other people by the simple fact that we all live on the same globe together. Okay? On what that means is there's a certain built-in connection, like I said. However, that doesn't mean the connection's absolute. It doesn't mean that we're all members of the same exact political community. So for Kant, sort of think about it like your family. Okay? You owe or have certain obligations to people in your family. You really should call your parents on their birthday, at least once you're, a full-grown adult. But you don't have to call everyone you know on their birthday, right? However, you do owe something. You owe less or fewer things to everyone. If anyone asks you the time of day on the street, you should tell them the time of day. Right? So there's a minimum that you owe everybody because you're human beings, just because we share the same globe. Politeness, can't steal their property, basic human rights. You owe some other people, though, like your family, or metaphorically like your family or your nation, you have a tighter, bigger set of obligations to those people. You owe them more, basically. So, for instance, I owe the rest of my country taxes to pay for the military to protect us all. But I don't owe, say, Venezuelans taxes to fund their military to protect them. However, if there's a Venezuelan in my country and they ask for the time or they need protection from a murderer, say, then yeah, we owe them that. We owe them that, at least. Okay. So now on to what Kant says about progress and history. Okay. So before we get into it, actually, I'll ask you all a question, and it's one of these multi-part questions. First, do you believe in progress? Pause the recording now and think about that. Do you believe in progress? Do you think that things get better over time? Okay, so you've paused and thought about whether you believe in progress or not. Now, hopefully what some of you will have done there is you'll have stopped and thought about it and then immediately said, well, what kind of progress, Professor? So this is something I have seen some of you do in this class already. And philosophers are very good at it. So some of you have already shown that you think like philosophers, which is good. But it's something we don't always do in common language when we discuss with people. Someone will say, well, I like equality, I like freedom. And we don't always in common conversation stop and ask them, well, wait, what kind of equality? When you say freedom, do you mean freedom to do anything or just, what do you mean by freedom? Okay, so in the class setting, when things sometimes move a little more slowly or with a little more precision, a lot of you are very sharp and immediately see, wait a second, progress? There's a million kinds of progress. Which one are you asking about? And as philosophers in training, that's what I picture you all as, is philosophers in training. We just want to remember that if we do that when we're having political or ethical discussions with someone, right? If they say killing, and they just mean something like murder and not all killing, or they say self-defense and you can't figure out if they think war is or is not like self-defense, we always want to clarify what we mean. So a bunch of you probably did think that. Well, what do you mean? What kind of progress? Okay. So then that's sort of a second follow-up. If that didn't occur to you, now start thinking about, hey, there's all sorts of different kinds of progress that he might be asking about. Okay. So I, going along with Kant, am going to specify this a little further. Do you believe in moral or political progress? He's really talking about political progress, but he thinks human beings improve morally over the course of human history. And what he's talking about here is how human beings improve politically over the course of human history. Now, if you've never thought about political progress before, the quickest example I can give you is that almost every country now in the world is a democracy. And if you're American, I bet you think democracy is the best form of political governance. Even if you're not, you probably think it is. But, sort of being very simplistic here, but basically, a couple hundred years ago, before America's Revolution in 1776, that's about 250 years ago now, hardly any place was a democracy. Right? Throughout human history, nations or groups of large size, very few of them were democracies. So, long story short, most people would say that for whatever reasons, human beings have made progress politically where we used to be in, say, monarchies, and now we've made an improvement with democracy. And once we sort of stumbled on that improvement, go America, it spread because it was so good, and then the whole world benefits from that. Okay? If you think war has become more rare, if you think war happens less often, that would be a form of political progress as well. Human rights being respected, that's not something that happened very often in human history before. Now it happens more often. Okay, so now that's the refined, specified question. Do you think that human beings make progress politically over time? And here's what Kant says. He says two things that are related. For him, they're related. One is he says, yes, I think we do, and he gives some sort of examples. The examples I gave are probably the most clear examples, but he gives some sort of proof that he thinks that we progress morally. Second thing he says, and this is sort of, it's sort of between the lines of our reading here. He mentions it a little bit towards the very end, but he says, if you didn't think that human beings were progressing politically, then human history would be, wow, it would be brutal, right? All the horrible things that human beings do to each other, all the monarchies that abuse their citizens, all the wars, right? All the casual indifference to the suffering of others. If that's just the way things were and that kind of stuff just happened for no reason, that would be really depressing. Kant thinks that if there's no progress, it's just the same violence and, crime and all this stuff. That would be pretty hopeless, and that would say something very dark indeed about human beings. But he says, if you want to have hope in the human race, you have to believe in moral progress, moral and political progress. Okay, so Kant's message in this reading, and I know this probably isn't clear when you read it because it is a difficult reading, but this to me is in a nutshell the upshot of this reading. As Kant says, progress does happen in human history, but it happens through conflict. I'll say it again. Human progress does happen. Human societies do slowly improve over time. Okay? But it's slow and steady progress, and it happens weirdly through conflict. Okay? So the way he says this in the reading is he says it's actually the vices, so bad human behavior. It's vices that drive us towards virtue. So imagine this, in the old cartoons, there'll be someone trying to figure out if they should do something bad or good, and there'll be a little angel on one shoulder, a little devil on the other shoulder. Kant's idea is that you can't force people to be good. Especially, you cannot force the entire human race to be good. But he says nature, but believe me, he means God working through nature and history. God actually planted two primary vices that we'll talk about, that is, two immoral desires into the human race. God made us be bad in two specific ways, but only because God knew that these bad things at sort of a macro, large scale across the whole human race would eventually fix themselves. Not that we would fix the vices, but that these vices, or sin basically planted in us over time, would produce things, political improvements that would sort of drag up the human race and improve us. I know that all probably sounds very strange. If we were in a physical classroom right now, I'm sure I would see lots of arched eyebrows. Okay, so Kant's very interesting, but I know from this reading it's a little hard to get these points. But it's important to read things in the original author, not just a little summary of it. So here's what Kant says again. He says, God has planted greed inside the hearts of human beings. And sure, some individuals aren't greedy, but as a species, we're looking out for numero uno and we want money. That's one of the vices. The other vice, it gets a little more discussion in this reading, is the desire for war. So human beings are greedy, we're also violent. Now this doesn't sound like a recipe for human progress, does it? Kant says nature, and just believe me, he means God sort of designed the world. It's sort of intelligent design, but for political progress. God designed the world in this way. He implanted greed in the hearts of human beings and a warlike nature in the hearts of human beings. That sounds like a recipe for eternal strife, right? Eternal conflict. But, of course, God is crafty, and if you don't like the language of God here, you can just say, human beings adapt. So when certain things happen, we adjust and we adapt and we invent. Think about it, democracy was invented by human beings. We can't give too much credit to America, but the short version is Americans invented it because they didn't like the way monarchy was going. It's way more complicated than that, but we'll just keep it at that level. So in response to our own greed and in response to our own violence, we do certain things to sort of protect ourselves from our greed and violence. And those are exactly the progress, the leaps forward in human history that will eventually save us. But you know this expression, necessity is the mother of invention? That's what's going on here. If human beings weren't greedy, and if human beings didn't fight each other, we wouldn't progress, because we'd all just sit around and hang out. Things would stay exactly the same. But instead, human beings have to innovate to try to contain the chaos that's inside of us. And successful ways to contain that chaos eventually spread around the globe. Here's the globalism I hinted at before. And improve not just the inventors, say America in this invented democracy thing, but they eventually then improve the whole human race. I'm sure France is better off now switching from a monarchy to democracy. And they did that after the United States did this sort of experimental new democracy. So Kant is actually pretty uplifting, but he's also pretty realistic. His attitude is, you're not going to get an omelet without breaking a few eggs. That is, you're not going to get the current peace that we have in the world, the current relative peace that we have in the world, without some conflict first. Another way I will put that is Kant would say the reason we have not had a World War III is exactly because we did have World War II. How wild is that? How interesting of an idea is that? Okay, so now let's talk about some specific parts of the reading. Okay. Remember what I said before about how Kant thinks it's important that we all physically live on the same globe? That's part of what he says guarantees perpetual peace. Guarantees that we're progressing toward perpetual peace. Okay. And we see this where there's those the numbers underneath where it says preliminaries. And he says, here's how nature, and this is God's sort of divine providential plan, has set up the world so that we can eventually make it better. He says, first, in every region of the world, it's possible for human beings to live in that region. Second, by war, nature drives human beings even into the most far-flung and inhospitable regions, and so we eventually populate the whole globe. Three, through war, nature or God's grand plan forces human beings into more or less lawful relations with each other. So let me give you Kant's version of history. And this also is sort of between the lines of our reading. So trust me, this is his point for this reading, but it can be a little hard to piece it together from the first reading. So what I'm saying, to be crystal clear, is write this down, because even if you read closely, this probably didn't jump out at you. Some of this he actually doesn't even say, but it's what makes the whole make sense. This is what Kant thinks human history is like. In the beginning of human history, you've got people, and they're living together. If you want to go the biblical route, think of immediately after the Garden of Eden. Okay, there's a family and all that. If you want to go a more bigger history, something like that, just think of the first human civilizations, or the first human groups. Okay? Now he says, if we were born perfectly good, we would just sit there. We would chill, right? We would hang out right outside the Garden of Eden or in the first human groups, and we would just eat food and hang out with other people, and nothing would change. We would stay exactly the same way. But human beings are born greedy and violent. So what happens is eventually in this family, one of the brothers is going to want to kill one of the other brothers. Just think of Cain and Abel. Okay. One of the brothers is eventually going to want to kill the other brother. Why? Doesn't matter. It's just going to happen. So what Kant says is the desire for violence will eventually break this family, this original historical unit of human beings, and then probably the brother who murdered the other brother is going to be exiled. He will have to leave that original human habitation. So that's why Kant says war disperses us throughout the globe. Now, because God/nature has made the earth habitable everywhere, if you have to leave, say, Israel because you killed your brother, you can go up to Greece. And Greece is a nice place to live too, and you can set up a new colony there. Okay? So this is what happens. Eventually, human beings start spreading across the globe and covering the globe. But we only do that when fights break out and either losers have to flee, like the losing side of a battle has to flee, or someone gets, kicked out of the community for being a violent criminal. Okay? Now, eventually, this goes on for a long time, but eventually then the whole surface of the globe is covered. But you wouldn't really call that progress yet, right? That's change over time, but nothing's really improved yet, so it's not really political progress. Progress, Kant thinks, comes after all that, but through the same exact way. So now you've got people in Israel and in Greece and in Italy, they're in Rome, and they're in England, cover the whole darn surface of the globe. They're in North and Central and South America, they're in Africa, they're in Australia. You got people everywhere now. Okay? Now what happens, because we all share the globe, like I said, that's important, and because we're violent, is eventually two different groups of people that share a border, now they're going to come to blows. Just like Cain killed Abel, just like a criminal might, rob from their family, something like that. Now, though, the loser can't flee anywhere because the whole world is filled up with people. There's no empty space to flee to now. Same thing, you can't exile criminals from Greece to Italy because the Italians are going to say, no, you're not sending your criminals up here. Now we get real evolution and real progress for the first time. And this is what Kant says. This is how nation states develop. Okay, this is how nation states develop. When you've got internal conflict, brother against brother, you have to develop courts, cops, judges, lawyers, all that stuff. Legislators, all the stuff we think of as being government. Now, I know a lot of you are down on government these days because, Congress has really low approval ratings and all this. Okay? But would you prefer to live in a wild, lawless land where Cain can slay Abel and then just walk away somewhere else? Or would you rather live somewhere where, at least in theory, there's police and laws, etc., that protect you? Okay, the nation state is an improvement over the wilds of nature. Okay, so that's one way that conflict eventually comes to make things better. Because there's criminals, we eventually innovate and come up with court systems, all those laws, all that apparatus of government. And now we're probably better off than we ever were before. Okay? But here's another way in which war improves things. And you got to tell me if you think this is really cynical, because it sort of is. Okay, you got, say, Italy and Greece. And now they've got a way for dealing internally with criminals. They built some jails. They wrote down some laws. They have some judges. Great. But remember, people are greedy and warlike. So eventually Italy looks over at Greece. Rome looks at Athens and says, man, they have a lot of shiny stuff over there in Athens. Let's go invade them. Okay? So what happens in response? In the same way that internally human beings develop government to protect against internal violence, they now create standing armies and nation states in general, with diplomats and embassies and all this, in order to prevent and protect themselves from war. Once more, why would you develop a standing army if you didn't have crazy neighbors who were trying to kill you? Now, once more, that might not sound like progress. You might say, well, wouldn't it be better if we just didn't have armies because we didn't need them because people weren't trying to steal each other's shiny stuff? Sort of. But think about all the things that the army does. It gives a bunch of people in the nation jobs. It trains people in different skills. It makes allies of certain countries. So now after World War II, we're allies with Germany and Japan in ways we would not be if we did not have armies there. Armies develop new technology. All right, so there's all these benefits, Kant would say, to developing an army, just like there's all these benefits to having government. And once more, if you don't believe that, then ask yourself, would you like to live 500 years ago? Either where you live now or in some population center. You'd probably die of disease, and early army medics were some of the better doctors, I suppose, in the world. Okay. If there was a disputed vote, something like that, there'd probably be rioting in the streets for months. You might not even get to vote 500 years ago. Probably not. Okay. So Kant thinks all these things are benefits and that they're driven initially by conflict and greed. Okay. That's all of human history in a nutshell, says Kant. That's how all the bad stuff happens, and that's how all the good stuff happens. Now, how does greed fit into this? Greed or selfishness? Well, I'm not going to say too much here because you've either heard this before or you haven't. If you've heard it before, you're going to get what I'm about to say as soon as I say it. If you haven't heard it before, it would take a whole class to sort of argue or prove it for you. So I'm just going to say it very quickly. Kant thinks that greed is good basically because greed is what drives capitalism. You only work in capitalism, which is the system we live under, because you're trying to get paid. It's not like you go to work out of the benefit of just to be nice, and then the boss, slips a little money in your stocking at Christmas or something. No, you go just in order to get paid. Even if you like your job, you wouldn't be there if you didn't get paid. Now, the boss only runs the business, designs the products, etc., because they want to get paid. Okay, that works out pretty well for people like Kant. They say it works fine. But here's the thing, you're saying, okay, that's not really progress though. How does that drive progress? Because that's Kant's whole point here. And now we turn directly to globalism. The only reason you know anything about China's government right now, the only reason you have so many inexpensive clothes in your closet right now that you like, nice clothes for not too much money, is because someone else was greedy. Someone said, if I can get this t-shirt made for $1 less, I could probably sell 10 more of them. So I'll make a bunch of money. It turns out labor recently was much cheaper in China than it was here. So someone went over there, started a factory, yada, yada, yada. Again, like I said, this either instantly you'll see what I'm trying to say, or you'll be like, what do you mean factories in China? If you have any questions about it, absolutely, always email me. So then what happens is, how this is supposed to work at least, is that the Chinese benefit because there's more jobs for them. You benefit because you got cheaper clothing. The standard win-win of capitalism. But once more, hopefully you're saying, yeah, but that's not really historical progress. That's just, it's good, buying and selling things, but it's not really progress. But this is what Kant thinks. He thinks because we all live on one globe, we're all in this together. So here's one way that greed improves us over time. Like I said, you now know something about the Chinese government. You hear news occasionally about what happens in France, in China, in Syria, all this. That means we're coming together as a human community. Doesn't mean you're going to treat everyone like a sibling, but at least you're not ignoring other human beings now. You're coming to know about their lives and know what's going on in their life. That's a good thing. Here's the other thing, and here's where greed and the love of war, the love of money and the love of war sort of fuse. And this is a very recent phenomenon that Kant was one of the first to understand. Greed actually prevents war. I'll say it again because it sounds sort of surprising. Kant thinks that the love of money prevents war. We love war and we love money, but the love of money prevents war. And you see that line where he says, it may seem difficult to organize a peaceful state, but it can be done even for a race of devils, he says, as long as they can think. The point is this. When war is about to break out, you could lose everything. You spent a whole lifetime working hard, scraping your money together, sent your kids to college, all this stuff. In war, your kids could be drafted and killed in the war. The government could seize your savings and all your physical property, use them for the war effort, and then you could get killed in war too. So among other things, this is not the only factor, but among other things, if you have a bunch of money, in general, you are less likely to want to go to war because you have something to lose. Now, the more sophisticated, more accurate way to put this is this. Between two countries, if they have strong economic ties, they do not want to go to war with each other. Okay, all other things being equal. We don't want to go to war with Canada in the United States because they're a major trading partner. So it's sort of hypothetical, but let's imagine we had no trade ties with Canada whatsoever. So we had nothing to lose if we went to war. And Canada pissed us off. Hard to imagine, but I guess it's possible. So imagine, we don't buy any lumber from them, we don't sell them any Oldsmobiles and Fords or anything like that. There's no economic ties. And they did something to make us angry. They kidnapped a few of our citizens. There'd be no reason not to go to war. We'd go to war with them like that. However, and this is exactly what happens in the modern global economy when every country is dependent on every other country to some degree. However, in the real world that we live in, we have lots of economic ties with Canada. Lots of economic ties with Canada. So even if they kidnapped a few of our citizens, same scenario we just did, we would at least hesitate before going to war, and probably we would try to resolve the problem without going to war. We'd still be mad at them, we'd still try to punish them somehow, but we'd probably slap a sanction on them or raise taxes against their products or something, right? We wouldn't mobilize the whole nation for war, because not only would we lose human lives, but we'd lose all this economic output. So now think about it. That's just how the modern world works. This is what Kant says. He says, greed drives capitalism. Individual greed is sort of a crappy thing. Individually, you're not a great person. But globally, at the macro level, it makes good benefits for everybody. In general, right? This is the tendency over time. It's not that every greedy person instantly makes the world better for everyone. That wouldn't be realistic. In general, it drives up wages, etc. More interestingly, though, is Kant thinks that eventually capitalism moves from country to country. It's not just Americans buying and selling from Americans, but it's Americans buying and selling from Chinese, the Chinese buying and selling from the South Koreans, the Iranians buying and selling from the Nigerians buying and selling from those in Congo. Now, every time you set up one of these stable economic ties, it makes those countries a little bit less likely to go to war with each other. War is bad. Greed prevents war, so greed is good. So we'll just end with a question. What do you all think about that? Does that sound realistic or plausible to you? Do you think that that's a decent understanding of how human history goes forward? Okay. Also, do you really think economic ties make war less likely? Okay, that seems like an abrupt ending, but that is the Kant reading, and those are the questions I want to open up with it. Okay, big questions about what's our place in the modern world, are human beings getting better over time, and why, right? The practical question here could be, how can we make war less likely? Okay, so that's our recording for today. That's Kant on perpetual peace. Thank you.